The email is fine. It has always been fine, but your finger hovers over the send button anyway, and something deep inside you whispers, what if it is not good enough? What if they read it and think less of you? What if this one small thing becomes the thing that finally proves what you have always feared is true? So you read it again. This is not a story about being thorough. This is not about having high standards or caring deeply about your work. This is something older than that. Something that started long before any email, any job, any relationship you were trying to hold together with the impossible weight of your own expectations. This is the story of the child who learned that love was conditional on performance. And there is a very real chance that child is still living inside you. You were not born a perfectionist. No child enters the world gripping a checklist and measuring their finger paintings against an internal standard of excellence. That is not how humans arrive. We arrive soft and open, completely comfortable being helpless, totally unbothered by the mess of learning. Watch any toddler fall down 7 times trying to walk. They do not spiral. They do not sit on the floor and decide they are fundamentally flawed. They just get back up, because at that stage, no one has yet taught them that failure is dangerous. So when did it become dangerous for you? That is the real question. Not how to manage your perfectionism. Not how to lower your standards or practice self-compassion through some 5-step morning routine. The real question is, when did your nervous system learn that a mistake was not just an inconvenience, but a threat? Because perfectionism is not a personality trait. It is not who you are. It is a survival strategy that worked once, and then never stopped running. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in your early life, probably before you had the language to even describe what was happening, you made a psychological discovery. You noticed something. Maybe the house was calmer when your grades were good. Maybe a parent smiled at you differently when you performed well at something. Maybe the chaos around you paused when you were obedient, exceptional, flawless. Or maybe the opposite happened. Maybe you made a mistake once, and the response was so disproportionate, so sharp, so loaded with disappointment, that your whole nervous system cataloged that moment as dangerous. Children are not philosophers. They cannot step back and think, this adult is struggling with their own unresolved wounds and is projecting their anxiety onto me. They do not have that capacity. What they have is pattern recognition. And the pattern they build their entire sense of safety around is this: when I am perfect, I am loved. When I fail, I lose something essential. That is the architecture. That is the invisible blueprint that gets laid down in childhood and then quietly runs every room you enter as an adult. Psychologists call it contingent self-worth. The idea that your value as a person is not fixed, not inherent, but earned, conditional, dependent on what you produce, how you look, how well you perform. And the children who grow up with contingent self-worth become adults who are exhausting to be. Not because they are difficult people, but because they are running a constant background program of evaluation, and that program was never designed to let them rest. Carl Jung understood something about this. He wrote about the persona, the mask we construct to face the world, the version of ourselves we believe is acceptable. For the perfectionist, the persona is not just a social tool. It becomes the entire identity. And the tragedy Jung pointed to is not that we build these masks. The tragedy is that we eventually forget we are wearing one. You are not a perfectionist. You are a person who built perfectionism as armor. And you have been wearing that armor so long, you have started to believe it is your skin. Here is what that actually looks like in a body. You volunteer for something, then immediately regret it because now there is a standard to meet, and meeting it is terrifying. You start projects with incredible energy, the planning phase, the vision, the beautiful unrealized potential of a thing not yet made. But somewhere between beginning and finishing, something shifts. A quiet dread creeps in. Because an unfinished thing cannot be judged. An idea that lives only in your head is still perfect. The moment it becomes real, it becomes vulnerable. So you delay. You call it preparation. You call it not being ready yet. You call it perfectionism, but it is actually grief, the preemptive mourning of an imperfect outcome. This is what psychologists identify as perfectionism paralysis. And it is one of the most painful paradoxes of the condition, because the very thing that was designed to make you exceptional becomes the thing that stops you from completing anything at all. The child who was praised for being the best becomes the adult who would rather not try than try and be merely good. Think about that. The fear of mediocrity becomes more paralyzing than the fear of failure, because failure is still dramatic, still eventful, but mediocrity being ordinary, being fine, being just another person doing an okay job that lands in a deeper, older wound. That touches the part of you that was taught your value lived in your exceptionalness. And without exceptional, who are you? That question terrifies you. It has always terrified you. You just learned to cover the terror with productivity. There is another layer here that almost nobody talks about, and it lives in your relationships. The perfectionist child does not only apply their standards to their work, they apply them to their love, to their friendships, to every interaction where they might be perceived as too much or not enough. Watch yourself the next time you are in a conflict with someone you care about. Notice what happens in your body. There's probably a moment, very fast, where you scan the situation and ask yourself, what is the version of me that keeps this person? What do I need to say, to be, to perform, so that I do not lose them? This is not conscious. You do not sit down and make a strategic plan. It happens in the space between heartbeats, in the millisecond before words leave your mouth. Your nervous system is already calculating, and the calculation is always the same. Error equals abandonment. So you over-apologize, even when you are not wrong, because the apology is not really about the conflict. It is about closing the gap between you and safety as quickly as possible. You take on more than your share of the emotional labor in relationships, because if anything goes wrong, at least it will not be your fault. You become hypervigilant to other people's moods, reading every micro-expression, every shift in tone, every slightly too short text message as evidence of impending rejection. Psychologists call this hypervigilant attachment. The nervous system trained to detect threat has learned to apply that skill to love. And the result is a person who is deeply present in their relationships, because they are always scanning but never fully safe, never fully rested, because rest requires trust, and trust requires believing that you are loved for what you are, not what you produce. And that belief, the belief that you are loved as you are, is exactly what was never made fully clear. Nietzsche wrote about the weight of the eternal return, the idea of living your life so completely, so without reservation, that you would choose to live it again exactly as it was, infinitely. He was not writing about happiness. He was writing about integration, the full embrace of your life, including its suffering, its failure, its mess. The perfectionist cannot live the eternal return, because the perfectionist is always in a kind of war with the life they are actually living, wishing it were cleaner, better, more impressive. They are always elsewhere, always in the imagined future where they have finally gotten it right, or in the haunted past where they are still replaying the moment they did not. The present is the one place perfectionism cannot survive. And so, the perfectionist almost never fully lives there. This is the hidden tragedy. Not the delayed projects or the strained relationships or the body wound tight with chronic stress, though all of those are real. The hidden tragedy is all the ordinary moments that passed by unwitnessed, all the good enough dinners that were eaten while mentally cataloging what could have been better, all the relationships that were never fully inhabited because you were too busy managing how you appeared within them. All the afternoons that dissolved into anxiety about whether the work was good enough to be seen. The life lived in permanent rehearsal for a performance that is never quite ready to begin. Now here is the part that might be the hardest to hear. Your perfectionism protected you. At some point in your past, in an environment you did not choose, in a family system, or a school, or a community that gave you very little room to be imperfect, it kept you safe. It earned you approval. It maybe even earned you love. And the part of you that built this armor was not broken or damaged. That part of you was brilliant, resourceful, a child doing the absolute best they could with the tools they had. The problem is that you are not in that environment anymore. The threat is not real anymore. Or if there are real threats in your current life, your response to them is calibrated to a danger that is decades old. You are reacting to a teacher who is no longer in the room. You are still performing for an audience that has long since gone home. Psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk spent decades studying this. The body keeps the score, he said. The nervous system does not automatically update when the external danger passes. It holds the memory in tissue and reflex and automatic response, waiting for the threat to return. And so, the adult who grew up in the presence of harsh judgment continues to prejudge themselves more harshly than any external critic ever could. They have internalized the voice. They have become their own most ruthless reviewer. You know this voice. It is fast. It is specific. It knows exactly where to land. And here is the deepest thing. That voice is not telling the truth. It never was. It was always a terrified child trying to manage an unpredictable world. It just got so good at mimicking authority that you stopped questioning whether it was right. Let us talk about what happens in the body. Because this is not only psychological, this is physiological. When you make a mistake, even a small one, even a completely inconsequential one, your body activates a stress response. Cortisol rises. The amygdala, your brain emotional alarm system, fires as though there is genuine danger. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts accelerate. Some people flush with shame so quickly it is physically visible. Others go cold and quiet. The shutdown response, the body playing dead to survive the threat. This is not dramatic. This is not weakness. This is a nervous system that learned to treat imperfection as a survival event. And because the stress response is exhausting, because the body cannot sustain that level of activation indefinitely, what happens over years and decades of this is a person who is running on a kind of chronic low-level hyperarousal, always slightly on edge, always slightly braced. The sensitivity that makes them exceptional in their attention to detail is the same sensitivity that makes ordinary setbacks feel like devastation. This is what researchers call high-functioning anxiety. The person who looks incredibly capable from the outside, organized, reliable, thorough, high-achieving, and is running on fear from the inside. The achievement is real. The capability is real. But the fuel is wrong. And the body eventually pays the price. Here is where it gets interesting. Because perfectionism does not only show up in the overachiever, it shows up in the person who never finishes anything. The creative who has 17 half-written projects and cannot bring themselves to complete a single one. The person who reads 3 chapters of every book and puts it down. The one who has been working on the same idea for years and keeps saying it is not ready. It shows up in the person who refuses to try new things, who declines invitations to experiences where they might look foolish or unskilled, who stays in the lane they have already mastered, not because they love it, but because it is safe. It shows up in the person who is incredibly hard on other people, because when you have spent your entire life holding yourself to an impossible standard, something in you starts to resent those who do not seem to share the burden. Projection, the unconscious act of placing your own unacknowledged feelings onto others, becomes the perfectionist shadow. The internal critic that was once pointed entirely inward starts looking outward, and suddenly everyone around you seems careless, sloppy, insufficiently rigorous. This is not cruelty. It is exhaustion. It is the overflow of a person who has been doing enormous invisible work for so long that the sight of someone else not doing that work feels like a profound injustice. And underneath the judgment of others is always the same question: if they get to be loved while being imperfect, why wasn't I? That is grief. That is the child grief of a person who works so incredibly hard for something that should have been given freely. So what now? This is the part where most conversations about perfectionism pivot to solutions. The child who built that armor was wise, but you are not that child anymore. And the question is no longer how to be perfect. The only question that actually matters now is who would you be without the fear? Not the polished version, not the one who has it together and produces great work and never lets the cracks show. The actual you, the one who is sometimes mediocre, sometimes uncertain, sometimes wrong about things and slow to admit it, sometimes brilliant in ways no checklist could have predicted. That person, the real, unarmored, imperfect person, has been waiting for you to come home for a very long time. And the tragedy of the perfectionist is not that they fail. The tragedy is that they so rarely give themselves permission to find out what happens when they stop trying to be flawless. When they put down the armor, not because they have finally earned the right to rest, but because they realize they were always allowed to. You were always allowed to be human. The child who needed to be perfect to be loved did not know that. How could they? They were working with the information they had, in an environment that did not offer them a better truth. But you are here now, reading this, which means part of you already knows that the old strategy is costing more than it is giving. The mask has served you. Honor it for that. And then, slowly, on your own terms, in the ways that feel survivable, begin to take it off. Not to be vulnerable, not as a performance of healing, but because underneath it, there is a person who is genuinely interesting, who has a way of seeing things that was formed in difficulty and shaped by sensitivity and is entirely their own, who does not need to be exceptional to be worth knowing, who never did. The deepest realization is not that your perfectionism is bad. It is that it was never the point. The point was always connection. The point was always the love you were trying to earn by becoming irreproachable. And the devastating irony is that true connection, the kind that actually satisfies the hunger, cannot be earned. It can only be received. And receiving requires being seen. And being seen requires letting the imperfect reality of who you actually are become visible, which is exactly what perfectionism was designed to prevent. That is the loop. That is the trap. The very thing you built to earn love is the thing that stands between you and it. So here is where this lands. Not with the list of things to fix, not with the challenge to lower your standards or make peace with being average, but with the single, quiet question that you can sit with for as long as you need to. What is one place in your life where you are still performing for an audience that has already left the room? That question has an answer. You probably already feel it somewhere in your chest. That is where the work begins, not the productive, measurable, outcome-driven work that your armor is so good at. The other kind, the slow, uncertain, unmeasurable work of learning to exist without needing to be perfect to justify the space you take up. That work does not have a completion date. It does not have a rubric. It cannot be done flawlessly. Which means, for you, it might be the most radical thing you have ever attempted. Which part of this landed hardest for you? The armor you built as a child, or the person you have not yet let yourself become?